That the only thing we have to fear is itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There's nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back again to another fun-filled episode, a very special episode of The Fear of God, your favorite podcast that takes place on Tuesdays about that intersection of faith and fear that's hosted by people named Nathan and Reed. So I'm going to dive right in with something right here because I'm not even going to have frivolity about the fact I'm here. My name is Reed Lackey, and also here with me is my good friend of nearly 2 decades, my old college chum, my long-suffering co-host, Nathan Rouse. Nathan, hi.
Hello, Reed. Glad to be back.
But we are not alone in this. This is a conversation that is worthy of not just 2, but this one goes at least up to 3. So we are welcoming in for the very first time someone that I've had the pleasure of chatting with a couple of times, and I admire his work and what he does and who he is very greatly. And we're very honored to have with us best-selling author JR Forasteros. JR, how you doing, buddy?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the show. A long-time listener, first-time caller, so really excited to be here.
That's awesome.
Well,
That's
welcome
fantastic.
to the show, JR. I'm glad you called in today. It's a very special day. We're running a contest today, so...
Oh, no, did I win? Am I
you won!
You won!
I do like how...
I don't even care what it is.
I do like how Reed was like... you implied when you said there might be, you said there's 3 of us. The way you phrased that, I can't remember your exact verbiage, but made it imply like you might have another mystery guest hiding somewhere. Like there might actually be a 4th person entering. So I knew JR was coming, but this is going to be fun for me too. I have no idea.
A lot of tension for the rest of the show. Is someone sneaking up behind me?
Right. Is it like
Oh, no.
Scatman Crothers? He's come back to visit us.
This is going to be awful.
All right.
Oh, my gosh. Well, we are here for a very specific intent and purpose, and that is to talk about a book that, Nathan, I don't want to tip your hand too much, but that you and I both, I think, loved, I would say. And that is one authored by Mr. JR Forasteros called Empathy for the Devil. We're going to have a really hearty time talking about that. But first and foremost, JR, we've got to loop you in on a Fear of God tradition, as it were.
Yeah, welcome to the party, man.
So before we dive into all of the wonderfulness that is your book, I first of all got to know what you watching,
Whoa!
what you reading,
What are you reading?
what you listening to.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Been working on my rock vibes.
Watching, reading, listening to. I'm listening to the new Dorothy album. Are you all familiar with Dorothy?
No, I've never heard of them.
They're like a blues rock band fronted by a woman named Dorothy. Their new album just came out, so I've been listening to that, and that's pretty good. I was gonna listen to the new Jack White album, but it's gotten terrible reviews, and I wasn't wild on the first couple singles, so I haven't even bothered to listen to it yet.
I do like Jack White though. Blunderbuss I liked quite a bit. That was his last
Great album,
one
right?
before this one, right?
No, there was another one. It was a blue album cover. I don't remember what it was called.
Yeah,
I could look it up.
blanking on it too.
I'm not going to do research. Anyway, the Paste magazine review, I think it was, said that he's an iconoclast trapped in the body of an icon, and that is probably my favorite sentence I read this year so far.
That's great.
Yeah. So anyway, the new Dorothy album I've been enjoying a lot. Reading. What am I currently reading right now? Oh, I'm working my way through Brandon Sanderson's latest installment of the Stormlight Archives, Oathbringer.
Oh, I have not read any of those.
Yeah, this one's 1,300 pages long, so I'm going to be reading it for at least another month, probably. But
daunting, just a month.
His fiction is incredible. His world building and character work is great. So very inspiring and intimidating as an aspiring fiction writer to read.
Oh, so, awesome!
Yeah. And then watching, the new season of Ash vs. Evil Dead just premiered, and
You stole mine!
Sorry, I haven't watched it. Yeah,
no, that's good. We'll share it.
Yeah, my wife and I are trying to finish Jessica Jones so that we can hop over and get to Ash vs. Evil Dead. So hopefully by this weekend. Yeah, it's a good Easter series, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now I'm curious, JR. So I've seen the first season of Jessica Jones. I have not even. I honestly forgot season 2 was coming out. Do you like it? I've not even started.
I love it. A lot of people are complaining that there's not a lot of action, and that's true. Like, it is a slower season.
Sure.
But this season is really all about what it's like to live in the wake of trauma.
Sure.
And
that sounds interesting.
It is. I mean, it's not perfect by any means, but I think it's awesome. So
cool. Yeah, I did enjoy the first season, but some of these Netflix marvels have been a bit hit or miss occasionally, and so, man, and I'm the type of nerd who's the completist. Like, I hate abandoning stuff midway.
So you had to watch all of Iron Fist, even though it was terrible.
No. So to clear that up, I am a completist in the sense that I don't like starting a thing and not finishing it. However, if I don't start it, a la Iron Fist, I don't have to worry about whether I finish it or not.
I wish I had your life.
Wow. Well, I impressed even myself when and we don't have to follow this rabbit trail too long, but Luke Cage, the initial arc of it got such huge praise critically. I was like, all right, sweet, and then this is, I hate even admitting this. Like, my wife doesn't get into a ton of these, but she liked it. And this is so embarrassing, but like, we got to the 10th episode and we were so bored that we've not gone back. Like, I was like, for anyone who hasn't seen it, there's a massive pivot in terms of the villain and the structure that is a really bad move on the part of the series. And you
the first half is great.
Oh,
the
yeah.
second half is pretty boring.
Oh yeah. Anyway, so good to hear you're enjoying Jessica, or Jessica, as David Tennant likes to say in season 1. So Reed, you've got your Ash Evil Dead. What would you like to say? You wanna jaw on that for a minute?
Yeah, I'll kind of focus my time just on that. So I can now officially state, having just absolutely loved season 1, loved season 2 even more of Ash vs. Evil Dead, and now thinking it was not even possible to love season 3 more than I had the first 2, I can now officially say that I love Ash vs. Evil Dead more than I love any singular entry in the Evil Dead series. I think Ash vs. Evil Dead.
Bold words, Lackey.
It is, and I'll stand by them. I know people may disagree, and I think the Evil Dead series is fantastic in a number of ways. I love that series, always have. But Ash vs. Evil Dead is kind of the perfect culmination. They hit such a bullseye for what they needed to do for that show in terms of the gore, in terms of the fear factor, in terms of the humor. It is really impressive. Honestly, it's very impressive how they managed to make each episode kind of self-contained, but then also keep this overarching story going that's not terribly burdensome. No, it's a really impressive show. If there are any fans out there of the Evil Dead series that have not yet seen this TV series, you need to just set aside, about 10 to 15 hours of your life and just catch it up in a huge gorge. You will be very, very, very satisfied. It's
a very bingeable show. If you
absolutely
don't want to eat while you're watching it.
For those of us who have not really dived into the canon of Evil Dead, is the show accessible beyond that?
I would say yes. There's some particulars.
I mean, clearly it's going to reward, the investment, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They reference things and use scenes from the film throughout sort of the runs of the series. But I think that you would be able, if you just had a knowledge, hey, this is a series following a trilogy of films and then one remake of the original film. If you just came in with that knowledge, knowing, hey, there's going to be some particulars I'm going to miss, the show does a pretty good job of keeping you up to pace for what's presently happening.
That's cool.
So yeah, I think you could, and the first 2 seasons are currently on Netflix to stream. Season 3 is not yet because it's not yet done airing, but yeah, it's very, very good and well worth checking out. I love that show.
I would be fascinated for someone who is outside of the Evil Dead universe to experience that show in a fresh.
Well, it is Bruce Campbell, right?
Yeah. Like Reed was saying, there's such a careful and singular and particular tone to the show that if you've grown up with the franchise, you're like, well, yeah, like it just. If the show feels like, yes, this is what it should have been, but I would love to know what someone who's just coming to it not really knowing what it should be, what it feels like. It was hard for my wife to get into the franchise because she didn't see any of it till after we got married.
Oh, and, interesting. Okay.
She's a very compassionate, empathetic person, and so the fact that Ash Campbell is such an awful human being made it really difficult. And I had to point out, like, yeah, but see how it punishes him so much, like, for being that, like, so that made it a little bit more okay for her to watch. But whereas again, someone like me, I just think it's just hysterical and fantastic. So
it's so funny.
Yeah,
it's so funny. And Bruce Campbell has got charisma to spare, man. He's so watchable and he's so fun to watch. But even the supporting cast, and I feel remiss I don't recall their names off the top of my head, but no, it's the supporting cast is also strong. It's just a really, really well put together show. So that's my contribution. I'll leave it at that. Nathan, what have you been diving into?
I'm going to sound like a pious turd here, but I don't have any like genre stuff to pull from lately, but I have been, this is a reading and a sort of listening to, I recently discovered, and Reed, I alerted you to this, a podcast called The Bible for Normal People, which I would encourage our listeners to check out. I mean, it's sort of as the title implies, it's just kind of like if you aren't, if you don't have a bunch of initials behind your name, academically speaking, but like that world in terms of the academics and the thoughtfulness and the kind of chewing on what kind of conversations are happening around scriptural interpretation and whatnot. And they feature a lot of really good guests, most recently of which, as of this recording, was Barbara Brown Taylor. But the one I want to highlight and really recommend to our listeners, one of their initial episodes that they just re-aired, and I literally just discovered this podcast about 3 weeks ago, so I'm very new to it, but featured Richard Rohr, and it was an incredibly moving sort of hour of listening and prompted me to go get one of his books, which I've just barely cracked. But the book itself is Things Hidden, Scripture and Spirituality, or Scripture as Spirituality. So I'm not very far into it, but a lot of the themes so it's a re-airing of a previous podcast that aligned with when he was releasing that book. So a lot of the themes are similar. So I'm really looking forward to that. I haven't read a ton of his material, but I've read and listened to enough of him to be a big appreciator of him. So I am excited to dive into that. But yeah, the Bible for Normal People podcast, Richard Rohr, anyone should read him and love him.
Awesome. Well, that was yet another very special edition of
What You're Watching, What You're Reading, What Are You Listening To? All right. JR, welcome to the madness.
Feels so good to be here. I love it.
Welcome to the show, buddy.
What's really funny, JR, is like, and I'm sure you'll educate us about some of this and our listeners about your hand in these worlds, but like, I was a relatively novice podcast head before joining Reed on The Fear of God. And it's really funny, you mentioned having listened to some of our material. I would just be kind of, in a purely curiosity standpoint, wonder what you've heard. But this stupid little jingle we just did, like, it's so hilarious to go back and listen to how it evolved. Like, initially there was nothing at all, and then it was like, wow, we are really idiots, and let's just really lean into that. So we really lean into.
You just lean in, yeah. That's what you do. That's how the great podcast things happen.
Yes,
just embrace
exactly.
it. We just embrace it.
Discover these bits of gold. Anyway, so yeah.
It's really how you reward longtime listeners, right? Because
that's true.
They hear it, yeah.
Right.
And then I remember when they just said that. Like,
right.
casual phrase.
Yep.
I remember when their episodes were only 45 minutes long.
Yeah.
Those bygone days.
Those 3 episodes.
They grow with you.
It's true. It's true. Well, speaking of, I have a number of things that I want to talk to you about, JR. First, thank you again for being on the show. But you are yourself an avid podcaster. Now, exactly how many podcasts do you have? I think I counted 42. Is
Something
that
like that. Yeah. Well, I only have 3 active podcasts right now. Not counting my sermons. So I podcast my sermons, right? So I'm a pastor, and I put my sermons up. So not counting that one, which is just posting audio that was recorded during church.
Sure.
So I have the Storyman podcast, which again also has evolved. We started out saying we were podcast about pop culture, history, and theology, and anymore we mainly do author interviews. So we bring on authors that have books that we think are interesting, and try to do a conversation that's not just trying to sell the book, but actually just something that's an interesting conversation that's book adjacent. And then do that. I have one called An All Things Charity, which we say is everyone's favorite Wesleyan feminist theology podcast, because we're pretty sure it's the only one. And I co-host that with 3 other female pastors who are in our denomination. We're all in the same denomination. And so we do it. That one kind of turned into a church leadership podcast. So we talk about theology and church leadership kind of stuff. And our main audience for that is leaders in churches. And then I have a horror film review podcast, a sibling podcast of Fear of God, that I do with my wife and a friend of ours from Ohio, and then the captain of my wife's roller derby team.
Wow.
And so, the 4 of us just watch movies and get together. And a couple of one of our co-hosts in specific has had some life issues lately. So we're about 3 months behind on our Bone Tomahawk / The Descent episode, which that's one of the reasons I was listening to Fear of God, doing a little research, because you guys have hit both of those movies already. So.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
And by the way, JR, when you guys discuss The Descent, just so you know, if you don't, there are 2 versions of that movie.
Oh, yeah.
And the ending of each of them dramatically alters what you take away from it. And
so The Descent is one of my all-time favorite horror films.
Okay. Well,
for real.
Well, what's really funny, there are these little, they're not even really apocryphal, but they're deep cut Fear of God moments in mine and Reed's history. One is, don't not talk about a 10-episode, TV series a la Stranger Things 2. Don't avoid talking about it until you're on air, because then you'll discover the tests and limits of your friendship of 20 years. The other one is, make sure each other knows if there are varying versions of the film you're covering.
That's amazing.
Hysterically, if you could probably hear it in our voices if you go listen to the Descent episode when we discover that we watched differing versions.
I have to go back and listen, because I didn't catch that the first time.
Well, we played it. We're good.
It's all in the editing.
Nice.
We're good at what we do.
Pros right here. This
But
is how you can tell.
it was so nightmarish, to be honest. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. But it was this really funny moment where I was like, wait a minute. What are you talking about?
How did yours end? What?
Right.
Yeah.
No, totally.
This completely diverts my thematic conversation.
Right. Oh,
I
man.
have no idea.
That's what's crazy about that movie, is the ending that you choose totally changes the point of the movie.
Yep.
Yeah. And we discovered that in real time while we were recording.
That's great. Yeah.
Anyway.
So you know what? And I don't think you mentioned it. The name of your horror podcast is one of my favorite podcast names ever. It's called Don't Split Up.
Don't Split Up.
Which I think is great.
A lot of people think it's a marriage podcast.
I was going to say that could be both. It could double as both.
Yeah, when we first started promoting it, I would tell people, I think the 3rd or 4th round of me putting it on Facebook, I was like, horror film review podcast, and a bunch of people were like, oh, we thought it was a marriage podcast, because I was doing it with my wife.
Right.
Sure. Right.
It makes sense.
I get it.
But double meaning.
Yeah, don't split up.
So you mentioned, that's one thing I wanted to talk to you about. You mentioned that you're a pastor. You podcast your sermons. So you're the pastor of, am I getting this right, Catalyst Church in Texas? Yep. One question that I kind of have for you is, I'm going to blend 2 questions here. I wanted to ask you, sort of what vocation pays your bills. Just tell us a little bit more about yourself. And being a pastor, how does your specific congregation, how do they respond to your embrace of culture, and specifically sort of your love and affection for horror films? Do you get much kickback? Or talk about that a little bit.
So I've been a pastor for 16 years, I guess. Started as a youth pastor, and then I was a staff pastor, and now I'm teaching pastor, which I'm the only full-time staff pastor at our church, so I'm kind of in the lead role. And been here 3.5 years.
Okay.
And so, that's my main full-time job. I do some freelance writing on the side, and the book. You make just dozens of dollars when you publish a book. So it's
true.
Really a nice secondary income there. And so Catalyst, we say we're a church for people that don't like church, and so overall, the church, I think, even when they don't understand my fascination with pop culture, they enjoy it because it makes it really easy for them to invite their friends.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They'll say, oh, like last year during Eastertide, we did a series on sci-fi movies. And we said, because we said that science fiction is imagining the future, and so the Christian scriptures have a particular vision of the future, and it's one that's not accomplished through human ingenuity and accomplishment, but rather through the movement of the Spirit as the church spreads across the world and brings all people into the kingdom. And so we sort of compared these visions of the future and visions of humanity in various science fiction films and engaged the vision of the future that we saw in the book of First Peter. I think it was largely First Peter. And so, at the beginning of each message, I would kind of talk about a particular science fiction film and draw out some themes from it and kind of the limits or possibilities of human achievement. And so, people just thought that was weird, but super fun because it was done in a way that was different, respectful both to the texts of the films and this sci-fi movie had a dad in it and we're talking about God as our father or whatever, like that. It wasn't like that.
Right.
And so they were able to say, hey, our church is going to be talking about Star Trek this next week or whatever, and people are like, what, how? And again, when their friends come, they don't have to be like embarrassed like that it was like a dumb connection or something like that. It was
right
we were taking these texts seriously, right?
Sure. That's something, and I didn't originate this term. I'm actually drawing a blank on the show where I first heard this, but that's a phenomenon I've come to call, but I can't take credit for it. I just can't remember where I heard it first. Called baptizing material, where you baptize pop culture, and it is essentially appropriation, where you basically say like, oh yeah, we're gonna eke out this very minuscule element, and that's one thing that we try not to do on this show. Like we do, obviously, because it's about the conversation between Christianity and horror genre. There are some connections that some people might be like, oh, that's a little bit of a stretch, but we really do. I'm excited to hear that you approach that way in an actual church body, because we try to do the same thing where we're just like, let's let the film be what it is, and here's what it makes us think about.
That's right.
And we're gonna maybe walk away with some things that maybe the filmmakers didn't intend or whatever, just because of the nature of the conversation. But
we might even disagree, right? We might come to the end and say, you know what, the message of this film is one that we don't agree with. And again, I think most artists would say, that's cool, like you're engaging it, that's what matters, right? So right. Yeah, I think that's just so much more respectful than kind of the baptism. That feels in a way like colonizing these texts, right? Like we're gonna put our meaning on it, and we're going to ignore whatever was there in the first place.
A great example of that we just recently discovered was our coverage of the film The Aronofsky Mother. The idea of quote unquote disagreeing with the text, but it actually, and not to pat ourselves on the back here. I mean, you're here talking about your book, so here we go. But it was a really fruitful conversation because there was so much. It was a smart piece of art that we had trouble with. You know what I mean? And so you're able to really engage it on a real cerebral and spiritual level, what the film is actually doing and saying, and being able to extrapolate, thoughts and feelings based on that, as opposed to like something you just agreed with up and down the line, where it's kind of a boring conversation, generally speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And JR, you loved. Now that might be a good segue. Oh, watch this podcasting magic. So JR, you loved Mother. It was my favorite film of last year. Okay, and so I want you to talk for a second, possibly even about Mother or whatever. But you also mentioned that Descent is one of your favorite horror films. Take a couple minutes, and I'd love to know like a couple of landmark films that are favorites of yours in the horror genre, and also what kinds of horror films that you like. If there's a subgenre that really appeals to you in general, but talk a few minutes about that.
Yes, I'm going to throw out some of my favorites, and then I'm going to tell you what I think my favorite is, and it's going to be pretty clear I don't know what I'm talking about. So yeah, like if I'm listing out my favorite horror films, I'm going to put in like The Descent for sure. If we classify Mother as a horror film, I don't know if it'll be it's like I like it less as a horror film than I just like it as a film. Now again, my wife Amanda, like, it is truly the most horrifying movie she's ever seen. In that she kept imagining herself as the Mother character, and she would act the exact same way, like trying to be nice and trying to just be like, please get off the sink, please get off the sink, please get, and so like it truly viscerally disturbed her at like the core of her being, whereas I just thought it was brilliant filmmaking. So yeah, I love that one a lot. Exorcism of Emily Rose is one that's always stayed with me as just like I think a really, really good film. The film that scared me more than any other movie ever has was The Ring. I saw that in theaters when it came out back in, 2002 or whatever, and laid in bed as about to graduate from college 22-year-old man and couldn't fall asleep because I was sure that Samara was going to crawl out of my closet and melt my face off. So some of the more recent films I've really enjoyed, I mean, Get Out, like how do you not just love everything about that movie? That I thought that was great. The Witch that came out a couple years ago, Roger Eggers, was so good. Train to Busan, like a great zombie movie. When I thought that I was done with zombie movies, like that one pulled me right back in, Oh man, yeah. So I would say the movies that I enjoy the most are, I would say the ones that disturb me the most are the body horror. So like The Thing or The Fly. I haven't watched Human Centipede.
We love The Fly here. Oh man.
They're just the idea that we lose control of our own bodies and that they become enemies of us, I think is deeply, deeply disturbing.
Absolutely.
And so those, I mean, I enjoy possession films, but they don't scare me. Whereas again, I have some friends that can't watch demon possession movies because it's too real for them. I love a good ghost story. I like a good slasher, but yeah, the ones that just get me, a really, really well done body horror, which I would even classify Alien, like the original Alien, as essentially body horror / monster movie, right? So I don't know if that gets, how's that for a list?
Oh, that's great. No, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think, and what's funny is that you're sitting there just rattling off these movies. Like, yeah, we love that one. Yeah, we love that one. Yeah,
see, I knew I was in good company.
So, yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, these are great. I think we may have covered everything that you mentioned except for The Ring. So we have a lot of affection for a lot of.
That's such a back. Like, gotta listen to that one. Gotta listen to that one. Gotta listen to that one.
Nice.
Start with The Fly.
Oh man, we have a lot of fun on The Fly episode. When you get to The Fly, that's a fun.
Excellent.
Episode. We enjoy that one. That's some great catching up. We've had a little frivolity and everything, but I do want to dive in and spend some time with your book because you a little bit of pregame / behind the curtain history is I knew your book was coming out. And I joined what I'm sure was probably the masses of people who reached out to you when your book was coming out and was like, "Hey, how'd you get a book deal? Because that's awesome, and I'd love one." I'm sure you never get that question, right? I was the only one who asked you that
only
question.
One, yeah.
Sure.
No one asked. Yes. No one.
But no. So then when the book was coming out, I forget exactly how this chronology happened, but you had reached out to a couple of social media connections, just basically like, "Hey, if you're interested in reviewing the book, then here's some contact information, et cetera, et cetera." And I will be honest with you right here, real time on the show. I thought, you know what? I've heard JR speak. There's a good shot this book is good, but sometimes you can be a great speaker, not a great writer. It happens all the time. And so I was like, but I'll check the book out because I'm curious to read it. And I was like, worst case scenario, if I don't care for it, I'll write a review. We'll throw a review on the site. I'll be polite but honest, and then we'll move on with life. And then we've been kind of in contact. I think it feels like since about November or December. I apologize it's taken so long. Yeah, apologize it's taken so long to get on the show. But I knew, I was like, we have to have a conversation about this. Like, I really genuinely loved your book.
Oh, thank you.
I'm not saying that just because we don't say that to all the girls. Like, I really enjoyed your book.
Wow.
And sincerely, I think that your book, which we'll get into in a second, hits on something that Nathan and I, and Nathan, feel free to jump in at any time, but like we talk a lot on this show about empathy for the other and you know, sort of how you treat the other. So your book really very specifically sort of tapped into some stuff that we've on personal and podcast levels been sort of scratching at. So I was like, we have to devote some time to this. So I want to just sort of start by diving into what your book is, and then we can talk about what your book's about. So the conceit of your book is great. It's called Empathy for the Devil. Why don't you set up as little or as much as you want to kind of what the thrust and the conceit of the book is in your own words?
Yes, I'm curious, since you guys have read it, did you know what to expect from the format before going in?
I had no idea.
Nope.
Nathan? Yeah.
Nope.
No, I had no idea.
So
I thought it was going to be purely expository.
Okay, so yeah, what was it? So for those who don't know, the book, I choose 7 biblical villains. And I wanted to ask the question, when they did the thing that they became infamous for, so when Cain killed Abel, when Delilah betrayed Samson, when Judas betrayed Jesus, when Herod ordered the babies to be killed in Bethlehem, right, at the Christmas story.
Good God, yeah.
How could they do these things? And I made the assumption going in that there are just very few people in human history who legitimately see themselves as a villain. Most people see themselves as the hero of the story, and they do the thing that they think makes the best sense at the time.
Right.
So, and growing up in church, I just always had heard, they were just bad. That was why. Like, Judas was bad from the beginning. Can't tell you how many stories I heard about how amazing Jesus was, that he kept the snake with him for 3 years, even though Judas, like, they talked about, like, Judas hated him the whole time, was planning this, like, elaborate betrayal,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I decided to set that aside and say, what if I try to connect with these people and try to put myself in their shoes, not with the goal of apologizing for them, or I've been giving it the Wicked treatment, where in Wicked, it's like, what if the Wicked Witch of the West was actually the good guy the whole time? Like,
Right.
not doing that. You're not saying Abel had it coming or anything like that, but just to try to understand their position before I condemn them. And then is there anything that I can? Obviously, they're long dead, so there's not much point in me forgiving them for anything or trying to build a relationship with them or anything like that. But is there anything I can learn about my own tendency towards sin? And is there any way that practicing, like sort of flexing this empathy muscle, can help me try a little harder with the people in my life that I villainize? Right, to do the same thing, extend the same kind of kindness. So there was like a near goal and then like a kind of a bigger goal. But psychologists tell us that one of the best ways to practice empathy is by reading fiction. And so I knew I didn't want a purely expository book, like you were saying, because it's sort of like when you have to explain a joke. Like by the time you explain it, it's not funny anymore. And I didn't want I didn't want to just explain these people. I wanted us to feel for them. I wanted us to begin to care about them. So I decided to try retelling their stories in a way that put us in their position. So we're seeing it through their eyes.
Okay.
And so each of the 7 villains has a fictional reimagining of their big moment. And then that expository chapter where I dive into the biblical history, I share some personal and some pastoral stories, and bring in some other resources to try to help us see ourselves in them.
Yeah. No, I thought that was one of the things that I really found impressive about the book, is because it's really great because in a way, man, I hope you don't think this is super cheesy, and I really hope this doesn't devalue what you were trying for this book. But like we've all been in those sermon series where they're like, now we're going to show you a scene from a movie, and then we're going to talk about that scene from the movie. Now that's super cheesy and usually doesn't go over very well, but in many ways that general rhythm is kind of what happened when you read the book. It's like you experience it in a very sort of fantastical level where you're engaging your imagination, almost purely your imagination. But you feel certain things as you read them. And then There's a little bit. By and large, correct me if I'm wrong. By and large, the expository chapters are slightly shorter than the fiction sections are. At least
actually, I don't. I'd have to go back and check the word count, but I would have thought they tended to be longer.
Really? So well, here's what's interesting about it is that in general they tended to feel a bit briefer. Now maybe that's just because expository has a different rhythm to fiction, but they tended to feel a bit briefer, and so it really was. I know for me, in my imagination, it went to more, sort of meditating on what I'd read in the fiction pieces. Not that your expository sections weren't also great, but my mind kept going back to sort of that connecting point. I
love to hear that.
Yeah. No, it was really, really, very, very good. I've been talking a lot. I want to give Nathan an opportunity to either, ask a couple of questions. We're all sharing the same notes, but I want to give a chance for Nathan to either ask a few questions or bounce some stuff off.
I don't know how. Is didactic the word I'm looking for? We want to be with some of the notes per se, but I did want to. It's funny, in sort of prepping for this evening, for this conversation, I was talking to my wife and thinking this through in real time. So to give you a brief backstory, JR, myself. So it's funny in your opening, I think the intro or preface or however it's termed in the text, you referenced some specific name drops of late 90s Christian music. I was like, we are kindred spirits. I was like, nobody on the planet should know who PAX 217 is, but I do, and clearly JR does. But anyway, so that kind of arrested me a little bit. But so I in high school worked in the Christian bookstore. I off and on through my late adolescence, early college years, post college, worked youth ministry. Kind of did those rounds, and I am a hopeful SOB in many ways, but life has created in me a very jaded attitude and feeling towards not just the merchandise of the church, but in many cases the church itself. I love Jesus deeply and believe he's the great redeemer, but church and I have a sordid recent backstory. So all that to say, this is good because my wife was like, you should really let JR know this stuff. So this will sound like I'm gearing up for a sucker punch, and if anything, it's on myself here. But Reed is chomping at the bit to cover the book, and I've worked in the Christian bookstore. I just know the stuff, and you hear kind of empathy for the devil, and in my head and in my sort of judgmental sort of spirit, which I'm not defending, just sort of acknowledging exists. I'm like, is this going to be like the edgy? You will know this. That stupid book on the shelves, The Bad Girls of the Bible kind of thing. I'm like, is that what we're dealing?
That was in my book proposal as a comparable text.
Really? All right. Well, there you go. So you know what I'm talking about.
I'm aware.
So, and in truth, to give The Bad Girls of the Bible their due, I've never read it. I'm just judgmental, and I see a cover and I judge. We're all just exorcising our demons here. But anyway, so Reed's pitching me on this book, and God love Reed Lackey. He knows I'm a hard sell, like I really am, and he's got to be like real tiptoeing around me when he makes these pitches sometimes, and it's like, okay, Nathan, just give it a chance. And isn't that right, Reed? Yeah, I'm speaking true here.
Yeah, and you should, JR, hold your thought. Yeah. You should have heard how many times I had to pitch him Eminem Stan, the episode that we did on Eminem Stan. You should have heard the conversations Reed. That we had about how many times I had to pitch that possible episode.
And now, pardon my French, but I jam that. I mean, anyway, so I'm trying to get to some good stuff here, and that is, I am cracking your book open with real tentative a real tentative spirit, and was just really, I don't know that it'd be too strong to say, very moved by your work. And we can, as we go, get into particulars, and I'll kind of follow Reed's lead in terms of specifics and bring those in. But I want to, in as much as you're able to receive, pat you on the back here, but also acknowledge, the three of us amongst ourselves, considering ourselves creative types and consuming this type of genre material and trying to do good in the world with the gifts the Lord has bestowed upon us. Like, we are predisposed. I'll speak for myself. I am predisposed to like your material. In other words, like, we are fans of genre, that sort of thing. And I think what was so riveting to me and resonant about your approach here had less to do with the content, although kudos, the content is strong, and more to do with the intention. And those two things married together created a very unexpected response in me. I mean, I texted Reed today. I was going through the, spoiler alert, listeners, the Satan material, and even though I just dropped a bad word on here, I did to him in more glowing, but was to give you credit here, effusively praising the work and.
Thank you.
And I'm saying all that, and this is why my wife was telling me to tell you this, because I'm not even saying I'm proud of this, but I am critical, and I want to be able to set aside in life, and especially as I engage the material from the church, I want to be able to set aside some of that cynicism, some of that jadedness, but that can be difficult at times, and so I want to applaud you on being able to put some of these thoughts in a cohesive fashion. That, to draw a real particular point here, Reed, I don't know if you wanted me to just run here, but
go right ahead.
To draw a real particular point here, and maybe this explodes us into some rich dialogue amidst ourselves. It is fascinating to me, and what I shared with my wife is, I came to this. My cynical self was like, okay, let's read about the cool villains of the Bible. I'm just being real raw here. Let's see how edgy everybody was. And what I found is something that is not. This is a broader statement than it should be, and I can recognize that, is not typical and is definitely not normal, and that is, to me, insofar as I understand the person of Jesus, there are maybe no more profound bedrocks of his work and his charge to us than enemy love. And man, we will fight like... I've got a baby. She's 14 months old. She hates having her diaper changed. She will thrash and scurry, and you grab the ankles and pull the naked butt back and are just like, please just put on this stupid diaper. Like, that is how we are when faced with what is, to me, the holy charge, and maybe the only and most important, sorry, I'm getting really into it now, the holy and most important charge of our faith, and that is to effing love your enemy. And not in this way that says, oh, but they still did this bad thing. To me, please someone stop me at some point, but...
You're doing well.
Your chapter, and people just listening to this with an unfamiliarity with your work, with the book at least, will think like, what on earth are we talking about here? Your chapter on Satan is powerful. And I read it and I was like, this is it. And this is what I mean by content plus intention. I would wager a guess, and I'm putting words in your mouth here, I would wager a guess you aren't saying of the most heinous people of the world, we just sort of turn a blind eye. That's not at all what you're saying. What you're saying is the real work that Jesus is calling and asking of us through his death, resurrection, and resurrection is a renewal of spirit to be able to look at the most heinous amongst us and say, you are still welcome here. And is there, like we love to speak in platitudes and oh, well, is Hitler in heaven? What a stupid question. Like you're totally missing the point by even asking that. The question isn't, is Hitler in heaven, as much as, would you feel welcome at the same table if he is? I mean, and so I was really challenged, and not even challenged because I don't think that we had countering opinions there, as in just like, this is it, and this is right, and this is good, and this is holy, and this is y'all's turn to talk. So,
well, yeah, I mean,
anyway, that was my long prologue to digging into some of the.
No, I'm glad that you felt that as you engage these stories, because my baseline conviction was that if God created all of these villains, then God loves all of these villains.
Sure.
And God always loves all of these villains. And God's posture towards these villains has never been anything but love. And so if by the end of my story, you felt something at least angling into the neighborhood of love for Cain, for Judas, for Satan, then I think that you're beginning to see them the way God sees them. Right? And I mean, that was my goal, is it's like, yeah, can we see this person that we would identify as evil or villain or enemy? Can we begin to see that person the way God sees them?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and can you, and this is, Reed, for you as well, like, I have my own thoughts here, but, JR, you are the one amongst us most directly in pastoral leadership role. Like, as you are observing your congregants, as you are in this role, again, I have my thoughts here, but what do you think is the most, why do we so loathe and why do we so resist that which I personally believe is so paramount a calling to gain empathy for the other? Like, why are we so averse to that? As you engage with congregants over the years and what have you, like, what are you seeing that feels common to that resistance?
Yeah. So for me to exercise empathy, which is, in fact, because it's Palm Sunday, right? And on Palm Sunday, you asked the question. Sorry, I don't know when this is coming out. We talked about that, but that we recorded this between Palm Sunday and Easter. So on Palm Sunday, I preached a sermon, and because the question on Palm Sunday is, how could the people who welcomed Jesus on Sunday scream for his crucifixion on Friday, right? Like, it's 5 days. How could that happen? And so I used an analogy of puppy love, because psychologists say that what puppy love is actually self-love. It's idealized self-love. When I'm loving this other person within that puppy love phase where everything's beautiful and, there's rainbows shooting out of each other's eyes and, there's puppy dogs and kittens everywhere. Like, what that actually is that I am loving an idealized version of myself. And the reason puppy love ends is because the other person's real self starts to poke through that self-love facade. And then either I break up with them because I decide, I can't love this person, or I begin to love them for who they are, not who I imagine them to be. And then that's where true love becomes. And so, I said, like, what these people were doing with Christ was they're welcoming as this conquering Messiah. Like, they're seeing their expectations of him, right? They're seeing the God that they want to see, the Messiah that they want to see. Yes. And Jesus' week in Jerusalem, he steadfastly refuses to look towards Pilate in Rome. And instead he criticizes the temple and the leaders of the temple and the religious institutions. And he's much more concerned about in-house matters with Israel, with God's people, than he is with what's going on in the rest of the world. And when the people realized that, they didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Right.
They weren't interested in self-transformation. They were interested in sort of a magic trick Messiah who's going to fix everything out there and just make the world the way they want it to be. Right. So I think with empathy, in order for me to have empathy, it requires me to set aside my self-love and my preconceived ideas of how the world should be and receive someone else for how they are.
Yes.
And that is the fundamental Christ impulse, right? Jesus emptied himself and took the form of a slave and humbled himself even to the point of death on a cross. It's also the exact opposite of the fundamental sin impulse, which is, you know what? I think that apple looks good. I want it.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, why? I'm not trying to Jesus juke the question, but I think genuinely, the fundamental sin impulse is my way, not thy way. And
Sure.
the fundamental movement of empathy is setting aside my way so that I can receive the other without condition, without expectation. Just receive because again, if we don't receive God like that, we're not changed, right? As soon as we put conditions on who God is allowed to be in our lives, we set ourselves up as the master.
Yeah.
So,
I'm going to interject here for just a second. So, and JR, welcome to the Fear of God.
yeah, thank you. It's so good to be here.
So this is kind of what, I don't know how much of the show you've listened to. This is kind of what we do, is that occasionally material, and we would classify your book in this material, just digs up stuff in us, and that's kind of how these conversations go. I had a whole slew of questions about the particulars of your book. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of set those aside for now. Maybe they'll come up in a later conversation, but I will say this, listeners, seek out this book. If you haven't already read this book, please seek out this book. It is so well worth your time. There's a lot of really good stuff going on, and we're gonna talk about some of that now. But I'd like to spend a little bit more time with kind of where we're sitting, which is what your book is about this nature of empathy and driving home this sort of how difficult it is and how necessary it is in what we're dealing with. And I'm sure referential points will come up about your book along the way. But if you're cool with that, let's just dive into that section of things.
Let's do it.
And so one of the things that I struggle a lot, and Nathan knows this about me sometimes, because Nathan and I have been friends for a long time. And so we have, not trying to pat ourselves on the back here, but we've got that kind of, that kind of friendship where you really can sort of dig deep, and even if it hurts along the way, like, you're going to be okay, which I'm immensely grateful with every fiber of my being that I have that friendship with him. But occasionally along the way, stuff will come up in culture or society or something like that, and we will wrestle at times, not he and I against one another, but wrestle with the issue of there's a tragedy, a trauma, a travesty taking place in the nation, and then on one level, you're struggling to seek justice for the tragedy, and then the compulsion for reconciliation will also sometimes occasionally seek empathy for the villain. And it is a very thin tightrope to walk and I just kind of want all of us to kind of talk about that for a little bit if we can, because one of the things that I thought was so compelling about your book is these are people that nobody is coming to the defense of. This is Cain. This is Herod. This is Delilah. This is Judas. These are people that are in language and in cultural significance damned. They are, cast out almost irrevocably. And yet here is your very compelling tome about how they are us. In many ways, they're who we are. And so when we look at things that are happening culturally right now as we're recording, there's a lot of conversation about the March for Our Lives, and there's a lot of conversations about that. We don't have to get into the politics of it, but feel free to do so if you want to. We were recently and are still very much in the throes of like the hashtag Me Too movement. There's all of these things where, and here's where I'm going with this, where it is easy, far too easy, to set up heroes and villains. And depending on what side you're in, it is super easy to say, you guys are the problem. You guys are the reason that you guys or this or your position or your attitude or whatever are the problem. And I have often expressed to Nathan, and sometimes even online, I've expressed a sort of philosophical and sometimes even spiritual homelessness, because I'm sitting here, I will usually lean one side or another on a particular given issue, but even while I'm leaning that side, I'm like, but you got a point here, you got a point there. And sometimes even in conversation, I can't even go there without getting just immediately a flood down my throat of all these accusations and everything. So now my question to you and to Nathan, whoever's got thoughts, is how do you generate empathy, and how do you fight for empathy without abandoning the quote-unquote victims? And I know that's not an easy question. Again, welcome to the Fear of God. But
yeah, so
how do you do that?
Let's take neo-Nazis, right?
Okay. Let's start with the easy one.
So let's start with the easy ones. So, that we had last August, we had the march in Charlottesville, which was when most white people were like, wait, I think we might not actually be over race issues in America. And interestingly, so I used to pastor in Dayton, Ohio, and a lot of neo-Nazis are being recruited from the Rust Belt up there, Detroit, Cleveland, all of those towns in northern Ohio, even down into Dayton. In fact, I don't know if either of you are subscribers to The Atlantic, but they did a cover story profile of one of the leading...
They got a lot of heat for that, too.
They sure did, yeah.
So he is from a northern suburb of Dayton. Like, he probably grew up less than 15 minutes from the church that I pastored in Ohio.
Wow.
So, like, that part of the country, like, I was there for a good 5 years. Also, I don't know if y'all read the book Hillbilly Elegy, but that also
I have heard of that, but I haven't read it.
So also set partly in a southern suburb of Dayton. So, like, all of that part of the country is getting...
What did you do to Ohio, JR?
I was like that before I got there. And I was like, sorry, guys, I'm going to go where there's tacos. So,
Right.
yeah, so... when I read some of the interviews that were being conducted with some of these young, angry white men, it was pretty obvious that beneath their anger was this real fear.
Sure.
And because what they saw, and this is from their perspective, they saw a world where the people that looked like them that were a generation older had lost their pensions, lost their jobs. The people who looked like them 2 generations older had lived and retired like kings, even when they had no education, even when they had no formal training in anything. They worked these factory jobs. They worked when I moved to Dayton right in 2009, right after the 2008 crash, and they had just lost like 30,000 jobs in the city because like 2 massive factories closed. And it was just like this horrible, like, I had multiple friends who had bought a house and then like within less than 2 months lost like $80,000 because the market just tanked and their house was worth like $15,000 all of a sudden, like things like this, right? And then these guys, so, their grandparents lived like kings because they had these like cush factory jobs, right? When like the height of American manufacturing, retired with these giant pensions, like whatever. Their dads were on that track and then lost it, probably when these guys were in high school-ish. And now these guys, there's like nothing for them. Right? Like they're like, not really. I mean, they could go to college, but they'd be the first person in their family ever in a bachelor's degree or whatever, you know? Yeah. So they have that sort of like generational, like devaluing of education and things like that. And so what they see is a world where people who look like them have fewer and fewer and fewer opportunities, while people who don't look like them, whether they're a different gender or a different race, seem to be getting an awful lot of attention and time and opportunities.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, I could not disagree more that that's a bad thing.
Right.
I think if you zoom out from just like one particular guy and his family to like our whole culture, let alone our whole history as a country, go back 400 years to the American slave trade, racial inequality all throughout here. I mean, it's easy to see on the macro level how what feels like loss is actually a balancing of the scales. But to anyone who's in a position of cultural power and privilege, justice is experienced as loss. Because if you're up here and it's being balanced, you are losing.
Right.
And no one likes loss.
Individually speaking, right.
Individually speaking, and that's all these guys are doing. Like they don't have the education, they don't have the cultural experience, they don't have the traveling to have had any kind of exposure to other perspectives.
Right.
And so all they are is afraid, and then they cover it. Someone comes along and says, "We can tell you exactly who to blame it on."
Right.
And we can tell you how to make this great again and take this country back and get back to the good old days. And they saw the good old days.
Sure.
Right? I mean, they never got to participate in them, but they saw them. So I can understand that, and I can empathize with that.
Right.
Without saying, you know what, those guys are right. They're not right. They're as wrong as could be. Like, they're on the wrong side of history.
Right.
For sure.
Right.
But if I'm going to have a conversation with one of those guys, I'm probably not going to try starting with like race relations.
Sure.
Right. I'm probably going to try to start by hearing some stories about their family and hearing some stories about like, some of their hardships and some of the things like, again, some of these interviews I've listened to with these guys, like they've not gotten jobs that have gone to minority candidates that, of course, in their mind are better qualified than, because we're all better qualified than everyone else in our own minds. Right.
Sure. Right.
So, again, I can completely disagree with their perspective while still understanding it and having some compassion. But again, if I, please.
Maybe this is we'll turn a corner here. I don't know, or just add to what you're trying to say and the way I'm understanding it. Like, I think it's funny. I've been thinking about these exact things, even unrelated to your book, and so it's nice that this is all feeding into one stream here. But I really don't consume a lot of news. I don't find that to be a worthwhile endeavor. That doesn't mean I don't try to stay informed, but like I try to be to sip as opposed to gulp, lest one that way lies madness. But I saw this kind of a bit of an anti the current Parkland activist person sort of railing about proposed gun control, and he's, bless his heart, he's going red on the TV or on the the iPhone that I was watching on or whatever, and he's like, his position is about don't reform my guns. I didn't do anything wrong. And man, he just drills down. He's like, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not doing anything. And sincerely, my intention here is not to talk about guns as much as to say, in my head, I watch that and I think, you're right. You probably didn't. Like, and to your point about the micro versus the macro, to me, this is where, when Scripture refers to powers and principalities, is so important, and we have got to keep that in view. Like, and it's important. I don't know, not that this should be a rabbit trail to follow, but like in the Atlantic's case, with that profile, I don't know that was smart. Like the point isn't to say to broader culture, hey, isn't this fella just, he needs your love. No, he does. And we as followers of Jesus would say, oh, he absolutely does.
And to be fair to the Atlantic, that wasn't what they were trying to do. I mean, they were trying to help people who were like, we have Nazis in 2018, and they were more
right,
this guy, and it was not. It was not I don't know how many people who listening have read it. It was not a kind article.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. Well, and to Reed's point, talking about that thin tightrope, and I think, feel free. I'm putting some words in your mouth here, Reed, but I think that what you might say is that challenge comes, the hard part, and what we might phrase as the third way, is the constant need to keep the individual present to us. That we can indict, we can condemn a power, a principality, a system, a methodology, a philosophy that preys on, in JR, in your example, the young, disillusioned guy in Ohio. We should condemn.
Well, yeah,
that.
And to your point, okay, so ask any of the like church growth people, like what's the least churched demographic? You want to take a guess? It's 20-something males.
Huh.
So like this same group that's being recruited by neo-Nazis is being basically ignored by the church.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I try to imagine if for the last 50 years the evangelical church at minimum had been preaching a gospel of loss. Saying that the path of Jesus is that he gave up his divine privileges, took the form of a slave, humbled himself to the point of death on a cross. Let this same mind be in you.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
This moment, it could not have looked more different, I don't think. If people had been excited about this opportunity and saying, you know what, this time that we are experiencing as loss is a time of great justice being enacted in our culture that's been too long denied, and we have the great privilege of participating in that.
Right.
You know? But to your point, evangelicals have not been trained to think systemically.
Right.
And that's where I think we need our friends of color.
Right.
White evangelicals have not. Now, black evangelicals have for years.
Right. Right.
I think if we were more intentional about seeking out the marginalized voices among us, though again, we don't even have to go outside of our own traditions, right? We can stay inside the evangelical tradition and find plenty of voices who teach us to see sin systemically and individually.
Right.
But again, we have not had this gospel of loss, this gospel of looking for God in the other instead of in myself. And so we were not prepared for this moment, to our shame.
Yeah.
Sure.
I have two sort of quick successive thoughts. I think, and I don't have your book in front of me at the moment. But I think there was forgive me or reframe this quote if I'm quoting it incorrectly. I think you said somewhere in the early part of your book that to empathize is not to exonerate, that they're not the same thing, and that just because we develop within ourselves profound empathy for someone, that does not mean, as we're sitting here talking about, that does not mean that you condone or we don't condone. Even less so proselytize the ideas that they are spitting forth. Mm-hmm. That we can combat that way of thinking while still viewing this person as a flesh and blood human being made in the image of God, whom the Lord has fearfully and wonderfully made and put great time and effort into and great divine intention into. And I think that's one thing that frustrates me a lot when I see a severe lack of that among faithful believers, because this is the place. I would be okay if anybody in this conversation or listening kicks back against this, but I'm like, if the body doesn't prophetically speak out that divine intention in the other and empathy in the other, who will? Like if we don't, who will? Because most of culture, I won't say all of it, but most of culture is going to side with who agrees with it. And is not going to necessarily fight for reconciliation, but is rather going to fight for the crumbs at the table, and they're going to fight for the bigger piece of bread, as opposed to saying, "Hey, how can we come now and let us reason together, and how can we reconcile what's taking place? And I see you, and you see me, and we really speak of these things." Like, I love to bring it temporarily back to your book, temporarily, that's hilarious. I didn't mean that. But more deliberately back to your book is one of the ones that was most compelling to me was your exposition on Judas. The sentence that has rattled around in my head since I put your book down for the first time is Judas lost touch with, I forget exactly how you worded it, but it's basically Judas lost touch with Jesus because of the way that he smelled. And listeners, if that intrigues you, then go check out that book, because let me tell you, once you read the Judas chapter and then hear how JR unpacks it, it will make total sense and might just blow your mind, might just change your world. Because that whole notion about like this doesn't smell right, but really, and you articulated this so wonderfully, really it just didn't smell like what he was on board with. And because it didn't smell like what he had really signed up for, he began to not only reject it, but actively work against it. And I thought to myself, for myself, about myself, and about the world at large, is how many times do we, like Judas, work against the active movement of the Holy Spirit and the active movement of the body because we don't like the way it smells or we don't like the way it feels? It's terribly convicting for me to think about that in those terms.
I'm itching over here. Can I add on to what you're saying, Reed?
Scratch. Go ahead.
So
we will let you talk, JR. We will.
Well,
you can talk about how much you love my book all night.
We're here to talk at you, not to you or with you. It's funny reading the Judas chapter specifically, and I'm glad I had other thoughts, but I'm happy to divert back into the text here because there's some really good stuff to springboard off into potential further conversation. This will be the longest Fear of God episode ever. So, as a brief aside, I had this feeling reading the Judas chapter specifically for some reason. I know Reed has watched this. JR, I just presume because we are kindred souls that you've probably watched Game of Thrones. Have you watched Game of Thrones?
That's true. I have.
Okay, well, and for me personally, I say that like I'm this devotee. I'm not. I hadn't read and haven't read the books. I do enjoy the show. I don't adore the show, but I do like a lot about it. Some of it I do love. Regardless, I had this funny feeling reading the Judas chapter of that experience, which the initial kind of couple seasons of the show did extremely well, of the Jaime Lannister conversion. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you're feeling as a viewer. When you start to empathize with Jaime Lannister, you're like, no, I refuse. I will not do this. I will not empathize with the Kingslayer. So that was really just kind of interesting. But you have this. I do have your text in front of me. I'm a better host than Reed. I'm just kidding. He actually gave me.
Let's calm
He actually
down.
gave me the version, the edition he had. So he's actually a much better man and human than I am. But I'm going to try to approach this idea and maintain my composure here. But there's this pair of sentences towards the end of the fictionalized Judas section, and this is sort of me patting myself on the back. Also, it's just patting on the back. Patting those who have helped condition me over my life to be an empathetic person on the back, that I have always been relatively. We all have our hang-ups and our subconscious and our inner things that we may even not be aware of. But in general terms, I'm a theater kid, and so I'm pretty empathetic. You just sort of generate those things. So it's not hard for me to empathize with someone who might otherwise be villainized, but you put really good words to Judas's story, and so kudos to you there. But you've got this lovely turn towards the end of the fictional Judas story where that arrested me in part because I see it so often in believers of today, and also, if I'm honest, trying to think through how do I manifest this in my own spirit. But Judas it's an italic section, and anyone who actually does venture out to get the book, of the paperback at least, it's page 156. And Judas is thinking to himself about having set up Jesus to try to provoke him to action and to military action and overthrowing things. And there's this moment where Judas thinks to himself, who will be at his right side? He's referring to himself, to Jesus' right side. And this is the section that really just floored me. And he says, who else but the man who did not lose faith, even when Jesus himself did? Who else but the man who had the courage to follow Jesus' mission all the way to the end? And I think, holy cow, how often we do that. And we look at the crucifixion, death, and resurrection and redemption Jesus provides and say, no. I think I've got a better way to do it. And Jesus, I got this.
Yeah.
I'm going to take care of this. You're good. You're good. You know what I mean? Like, this is how we behave, and how much of what a just even mildly conscious, and if we can use the word woke, believer observing the church's behavior sees, which is, good Lord. You know, it's you talk about unchurched people. Like I think Reed would echo this of himself. Like, I have peers who are unchurched and who will comment to me, and this is sincerely not me patting myself on the back, who will be like, Nathan, you're not kind of like what I think of when I think of a faithful person or a Christian person. And I'm like, I appreciate that. I'm really disheartened and saddened and brokenhearted that because what they are seeing is people of faith saying, no, Jesus, I got this, you know? Right. And I was just really challenged and moved clearly by that because and I don't want to, you know, I sincerely don't want us to go for 5 hours tonight because I'm on East Coast time and y'all aren't. You know, I don't want to tip my hand too hard to some of my thoughts on Satan. I feel like the church lady. Satan? Could it be Satan? You know, but the power of forcing oneself And this is what I would say to that disillusioned 20-something kid in Ohio is like, and he doesn't have the resources. He has not been exposed to this. And so how much we can indict him is really kind of on us. But you've got to force yourself to empathize and to say, wait a minute, as a real world example, and this may seem random, but listen to any of our podcasts of the last year and it won't be hard to see my level of animus towards our current administration, and I've had this real challenge in my spirit because of how much I admire our previous administration, but I've really had this challenge on my spirit to say, well, you know what? The third way would still say I was probably too open-hearted there. Not as in we shouldn't be open-hearted, but as in like I probably wasn't critical enough. I didn't practice my discernment enough previously. And I'm following a rabbit trail too much there, but my point simply is how often we look to Jesus or look at Jesus and say, way to go, buddy. I got it. And so feel free to chat on that for a minute if anybody wants to.
Yeah. Go ahead, JR.
I really think the biggest tragedy of the Judas story, and I've read about this in the nonfiction, and then I actually also did a little deleted scene with it, but
will you share that deleted scene? I don't know if this is where your thoughts are going, but I've heard this, and I would love for you to share that deleted scene.
Yeah, sure. So the real and this is why I wrote the sentence that you read, right? Judas is like, I'm following Jesus' mission all the way to the end, but he doesn't, obviously. But then he commits suicide, right? I mean, so the only real difference between Judas and Peter or any of the other disciples who fell away is that Judas doesn't get that restoration scene.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Because he's dead. And so I kind of have this moment in the nonfiction where I am like, imagine if he could have been on the beach where Jesus confronts Peter and he says, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And the first few times Peter's like, yeah, of course I love you. And he's like, yeah, did we just do this? Am I confused? And then the third time he says he realizes it's because Jesus denied him 3 times. And so there's this beautiful, gracious restoration where Jesus acknowledges what he did, but then restores him into the beloved community. And it's like, of course, Judas would have gotten that too.
Sure.
And so I wrote this. It wasn't really a deleted scene, I guess, because I didn't delete it. But I did write a scene where, I love alternate history. So I just had the rope broke or whatever. Who cares? Judas's suicide didn't take. And so he ends up on that beach. And of course, Peter particularly is furious with him for what he did. And then yet Jesus is there and Jesus comes up and greets him with a kiss because that's how Judas betrayed him. And that's his way of, again, at once being acknowledged, but then folded back into the beloved community. And so, Judas became surprisingly heartbreaking for me,
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever seen a film, I'm only going to hit and run on this, but have you ever seen a film from 1977 called Jesus of Nazareth? Have you ever seen that?
No.
That long miniseries? I would encourage you to check it out. It's it was the 40th anniversary last year, so I think they just released a new DVD. It's 6.5 hours long. JR, I am not kidding. It is to this day the greatest portrayal of the life of Christ that I've ever seen.
Okay.
In terms of Anthony Burgess, if you know that author, wrote A Clockwork Orange. He wrote the screenplay.
Wow.
Franco Zeffirelli directed it. The director of Romeo and Juliet and the Hamlet that starred Mel Gibson. And so it's got some heft behind the cast and the creative team. It's got a who's who of 70s actors. If you looked up the cast. But I'm constantly trying to get people to watch that film, and the length is daunting to them. We're recording this right on Easter, so it's a good time. Look it up, seek it out. It is so worth your time. And the reason I'm bringing it up here is because Ian McShane plays Judas.
Nice.
And he delivers. It is a very, very strongly empathetic portrayal of Judas in that film. To the degree that it was criticized slightly for how empathetic it was to the character of Judas. Judas is portrayed very empathetically. He is under the lure, without spoiling too much, he's under the lure of a very influential Pharisee, a fictional Pharisee, played by Ian Holm.
Nice.
So he's under the influence of this Pharisee and is very much persuaded into something akin to what you sort of expounded upon in your book and imagined in your book. But I cannot recommend that film enough. I'm not going to spend more time on it. Just
go get it.
Seek out Jesus of Nazareth with Robert Powell as Jesus, directed by Franco Zeffirelli. 6.5 hours long, worth every minute. It's wonderful. Anyway, yeah, I wanted you to share that deleted scene because I even got a little emotional as you were talking about it. I thought that image is so profoundly beautiful, but immediately resonated in my spirit of that's Christ. That's who he is. That's what he does. That is, every like fire in my bones, everything woke up when I heard like, yes, that would have been the posture, not finger wagging, not grandstanding, not too bad you missed it, buddy, but that.
And also not ignoring it and pretending it didn't happen, right? I mean, that's exactly. I think that's important, like, because you said that earlier. He's not Judas. That was awkward. No, like there's a naming of the sin, but in a way that is gentle and in a way that opens up space for repentance, right? And I think the church is bad at that.
Yes.
Yeah, no question about it. Go ahead, Nick.
I mean, there's so many stupid directions I could go here, but I remember on that particular note, as fruitful as social media conversation can be, which is to say very little, sort of verbalizing this idea that like, because what you see so often, and both of you just sort of brushed up against this about sin and the naming of it and what have you, but what you see so often from the church, and we could manifest it or label it as that Judas idea of don't worry, I got this. We are so good at throwing the stone, and something I said or thought and then ultimately verbalized on social media was we focus so heavily on the sin, and which isn't to suggest that sin doesn't matter or that it there isn't an economy there, but we reduce the goodness of Jesus by letting sin have the last word in terms of how we treat and how we interact and how we observe and what we do collectively to those who get it wrong. I love, JR, what you just said 30 minutes ago now of the gospel of loss. And, I think, like, I may try to figure out in my own spirit and words how to adopt that and adapt that to, I encounter, again, this won't come as much of a surprise given the prologue I gave of myself, but we're relatively minimally heavily active in church right now, and so but I do have occasion and work with a couple of people who would count themselves as Christian, and that sounds real dismissive. I don't mean it to, but we are very different, and there is this sense of this capitalistic type of thing, and this marriage of Christian faith and capitalism, which isn't a trail I want to follow, except in so much as to say your language of the gospel of loss is so profound and so appropriate and so right, and we are so wrong in ignoring it because it is so sort of like what I tried to articulate, and I don't know how well I did, in terms of the notion of empathy and the bedrock foundational tenet of Jesus's teaching to us regarding empathy. Like, the gospel of loss shouldn't be a novel phrase. It should just be, because that is what it is. It is, Reed and I talk a lot on the show, and go back and as early as our Cloverfield Lane of, 2 years ago, like this notion of safety and fear. Like, we are so desperate to, and again, it is not my intention in this moment to browbeat these things, but I've seen so much lately the conversation around firearms of the God-given right, and I think, no, brother, no, you're kind of wrong there. Not because I want you to be wrong, but because your God-given right is to lay down your life for your friend, or your enemy. Like, that is the right that is imbued to the Christian and the faithful follower of Jesus. Like, all these other things don't really matter. Are not quote-unquote rights. I understand the semantics here. All I'm trying to say is the gospel of loss would tell us, and the gospel of Jesus, whose gospel tells us you must lose your life to gain it. And I think we would do well to meditate on that, if you will.
Well, and it's scandalous to think, and I do want to get back to one thing about empathy for villainy, but it's scandalous, and we've lost the scandal now at this point of Jesus's death to his contemporary disciples.
Right.
Like that, like the view that I am only going to scratch up the surface of that, like that of a defeat. That this was ultimately a defeat. That as Christ is marching towards victory, it looked like they scattered, they ran, they scattered. And one of the things that really stands out to me is Peter's sort of mode and operation at that point. You want to talk about empathy for the villain. This is how I'm going to tie all this together. JR, thank you for your patience. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for letting Nathan and I just unload on you all of these things.
You didn't know you were having pastoral therapy here.
No, this is great. I'm here for this. It's good. It's all right.
So I'll give you a therapy bill.
When Reed said this, what I heard was, I'm just kidding. I was making a therapy joke here. Sorry, Reed. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. But let's look at this. A moment that you didn't write about, but I think is right in line, and correct me if I'm wrong, with the spirit of your book. The night that Jesus is arrested, I forget precisely because I'm bad at this, which gospel it's articulated in, but Peter had professed to Jesus beforehand, even if everybody else loses faith, I won't lose faith, even if everybody else does. And as I'm thinking about this moment, why was Peter so bold? I mean, Peter was a bold personality anyway. Peter was so he was always sort of the risk taker, as it was in the text. But why would he feel so bold as to say, like, everybody else can do whatever they want to, but I will be there? Why did he feel that way? And again, I'm pulling a Forasteros right now, and I'm imagining that part of that is because he had his sword. He had it. He had his weapon. He had it that he was going to be able to attack this. And what happens the night that Jesus is arrested? They come charging for him. Peter is right there in the fray, claims that weapon, this piece of security that he has, and lobs off the ear of one of Christ's attackers. And this is what's so scandalous, and this is what, in my mind, at least partially was responsible for blowing their mind and sending them running, because they didn't know how to be anymore. They didn't know what to do anymore in this. When Jesus picks up the ear of the enemy, picks up the ear of the man who is about to take him off to die, and picks up that ear and restores it right there in that moment. And yes, we talk about put away your sword and all the implications there. I don't want to easily breeze past that. I think that's important and vital. But my point is, Jesus picked up the ear of his enemy and healed him in that moment so that he could be led away to die. Why have we appropriated the gospel into this power-mad, power-hungry, security-laden thing where we now will revel in and dance on the grave of our enemies rather than picking up their woundedness and reaching out in restoration? That's what hurts when I try to think about what's happening to us. In this us, the capital U is the church, the large evangelical church, where we're no longer picking up that ear and reaching out and saying, here's healing for you. Instead, we're like, get him, lob off the head next time, slash out the armies, and thinking that Christ would be standing there as anything other than brokenhearted by that. And here's what I would say. I'm going to say this and I'm going to shut up because I need to calm down. Is that, is this notion of to think that if the bodies of the enemies were decimated right there, yes, the bodies of the enemy, let's imagine for a minute, bodies of the enemies are decimated. Peter led with his sword, everybody led with their sword, and then everybody walks away. The enemies are vanquished. Who will remain is Jesus picking up the dead and the broken and the wounded and healing them and saying, neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. Whatever else, other words he would have chosen to use at that moment, picking them up, restoring them, grafting them into the body, and then sending them on their way. That is the Spirit of Christ. And I think largely anything in opposition to that, I would consider that anti-Christ, to be in a non-restorative posture for that. Empathy for the devil, everybody.
I think what we're discovering here is that Reed and I just need a live audience. So JR, I mean, you're really just kind of a warm body over there, buddy.
Happy to be here.
Reed, we need to start lining up more guests just so we can preach at them, and Nathan can exercise his angst at them.
But JR, your book is powerful. This is why why I think it's so necessary. Like, you're like, yeah, we haven't talked a lot about the particulars of your book, and we will do that before we wind down the conversation, which we probably should soon. But honestly, like, your book is great. This is the kind of thing that it stirs up. It's convicting. It's encouraging. It's inspiring. This is an important conversation. It's an important thing that you've grafted out here, and I treasure you for it, and I treasure that it's in the world. I treasure that those words are on the page, and I appreciate what the work that you've done here. So yeah,
real quick, and I know you're trying to wind us down, Reed. I'm going to ramp us back up one more time.
Here we go.
Then we can land the plane, because I feel like we have to talk about the monster at the end of the book, which is my head is too big to wear a hat, JR, but I would, if I had one on right now, I would take it off, and hats off to you for that title. Fine work, sir. Fine work on the monster at the end of the book. I was like, where's Grover? Come on. So for listeners who, one, just order the stupid book on Amazon. It's not stupid. That was hyperbole. But order the book on Amazon. Check it out. We are moving into the closing credits here. But JR ends his book with a chapter on... It's so funny, because I'm like, it's in the title. You really shouldn't have seen. This should not have been a surprise. Like, it ends with a chapter on Satan. It ends with a chapter on Satan. And, I like, what a great feeling to be a cynical SOB like myself sometimes. And just to be like, to engage a piece of material being like, all right, Forasteros, I'm about to talk to you live and in person tonight, but you got your work cut out for you. And starting that chapter, and let me tell you, brother, by the end of it, I was like, slow clap. Slow clap. He did it. He landed the plane. It's like people who whine about the end of a TV show and like, oh, it was all great until the end. So kudos there. So patting you on the back there. And It's funny. I led with this notion and encouraging you and want to reiterate that, like, it isn't that the content is strong. The content is strong. It's the intention married to the content. Your ability in that last chapter, the fictionalized version. So for listeners, if it happens that you don't end up getting around to reading this anytime soon, this final chapter on Satan is 3. I think there's 3. 4. Okay. There's 4. It's a sequence of vignettes, all kind of in the same location, and it's. I mean, goodness gracious, it is. If I received this as utter compliment, if Frank Peretti was awesome today, it's like, all right, that's it, but it's,
there's like 5 listeners are gonna get.
I know. Well, that's all right. Yeah. A lot of our listeners will get it.
Cut.
Yeah. But even beyond that, like, think Listener, Pilgrim's Progress, this idea, that feeling, and I mean, I'm just describing my experience of reading that chapter. You start naming the angelic beings, and I'm like, damn, that's pretty good. Like just having that feeling, and then the triune himself or God and Son are both the name, and I was like, oh, that is good. So yeah, I had all these feelings reading this chapter, and I want to do my best to encapsulate so that I can go to bed at some time tonight. I think what was so powerful to me about that chapter, and what I would sort of tag back in on y'all's mutual imaginings of the Judas story on the beach, like, maybe is this a theological flight of fancy? I don't know. Is it part of what I truly believe about the redemptive power of Jesus? Yes. What I was so drawn to about the execution of the Satan chapter and the fact that it is the culmination of a book about empathy, and that the most heinous of villains are worthy of consideration in the realm of not just self-reflection, but what do we do with them? What does Jesus do with them? I think I was so touched and moved by this notion that absolutely and utterly the most heinous, not just of actions, but of beings, of what have you, in the end is swallowed up in the goodness of Jesus. And that is an extremely moving, powerful sort of proposition to me. And I understand, creative license and that sort of thing. And so I recognize that at work, but I think it's Stephen King, who says, I'm totally going to butcher this and read, I bet you know where I'm trying to go here, that the writer lies to tell the truth.
Fiction is the truth inside the lie.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. And I think that is what is so missing. It is a major puzzle piece that feels like a missing limb in how the church operates so much. And I sincerely hate painting with so broad a brush, but it is just as you observe in our comings and goings as American Christians, what feels like a missing limb. We have amputated, and read what a beautiful image of the bodies that we are executing on the battlefield, that Jesus comes behind us and heals and restores. Like, that is the gospel of Jesus. That even the acts that Satan himself, and I love your, like, hey, we really don't know what this exactly was. I loved that in your expository section about Satan. But again, if we're going with this utter personification of malevolent evil, even Satan himself will not stand, and not even just will not stand in this combative, militaristic way we love to parade, but will be loved and welcomed and absorbed and redeemed, as all things in creation will. I don't know, and maybe that's my own sort of rabbit trail out of what I was reading, but, again, slow clap, JR. Welcome. Welcome to the Fear of God.
Thanks.
I don't know that either Reed or I knew this episode was going to be what it is, but, welcome to the club.
Here's what I'd like to do. So I'd like to be respectful of your time, JR, and so I'd like to close with
He's got this really big clock right next to the computer. He's like, Dad gum, these guys,
like,
they need some help.
No, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to do maybe three things, and then we'll wind down. So the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like you to talk for a few minutes, JR, if you could, about that Satan chapter, either its inception, something you want to say about it, anything that you want to do. So I want you to sort of talk a little bit about that. And then maybe Nathan and I can just share just real briefly sort of our favorite section of the books. We've maybe, tipped our hand a little bit at that.
Yeah, I've already done that. But
okay, so yeah. So I think he's So I will go ahead and skip to that part right now. His favorite section, I'm guessing, is Satan. My favorite was Judas. Like, Judas was the one for me. Like, again, is that it rattled in my head long after I put the book down. That whole, he rejected Jesus, or began in opposition to Jesus because of the way he smelled. That whole thing just really rattled my cage, and I appreciated it so much. So maybe then the last thing that I want to do is if you have any questions for us as readers of your book, that we haven't already touched on, that you'd like, a little bit of sort of perspective on, or something like that, and then we'll wind down with a big old send off for everybody to go read your book, and that's great.
Yeah. So the Satan stuff, he was probably the second villain that I had a pretty clear vision of how I wanted to write the chapter.
Okay.
Herod was the first. I actually had the idea for doing that, essentially that short story of Herod.
Okay.
Where the Magi appear in his throne room and what that would mean for him for a few years. And I actually, for a long time, I had been intending to write it as a short story to give as a gift to my friends and family for a Christmas one year. Like, just as a, hey, I made something. I wrote this.
That's a neat idea. Yeah.
And then I didn't do it because, if you want to do that, you have to start it in like August, and I would never think about it until like December 15th.
Exactly.
And I was like, oh yeah, I remember last year when I had that idea, I forgot about it again. So then when it came time to write the book, my editor, or my agent, asked me if I had any ideas, because the proposal that we had shopped, no one wanted it. It's like, well, I had this idea about Herod. I was like, I have an idea I could do about Satan. Oh, and Cain. So those were kind of the first three that I kind of had some idea of what I wanted to do. And I actually, when I sat down to write the proposal, so when you sell a nonfiction book, you don't have to have the whole book written. You just have to have 2 or 3 chapters. So I thought, well, hey, I'll do one of the characters, right? Just do the nonfiction and the fiction.
Sure.
So I started with Cain. I got about 600 words in. I was having a blast. I was like, you know what? This one's like a little strange. maybe I won't lead with this one. Maybe so. I went and wrote Cain instead, and that's the one that got IVP'd up by the book. But Satan was the one I was most looking forward to. Nathan.
That's the best out of context sentence.
I know, right?
That's great.
The names of the angels. So that's like, I've always tried to imagine what it would be like to be an Israelite and have everyone's name be like words, like regular words. Like Abraham means exalted father. So what would it be like to be like, oh yeah, this is my dad, exalted father? Be like, hi, I'm exalted father. Nice to meet you. Right? Like that would just like,
and they're like, it's kind of redundant. I know.
Right. But that's how everyone's named. Everyone's names meant these things. And so when it came to the angels, because I wanted to create a little bit of distance between the reader and their assumptions of Satan.
Sure.
So that my story had room to take root.
Yeah.
And not just get consigned to the fire bin. The burn pile, So I decided, what if I kind of make it feel a little bit more fantastical? It was already set in the throne room of heaven, and so obviously, like, that's, no one knows what that looks like, really. We have like some visions from some various prophets in scripture, and they don't all align exactly. So it kind of freed me up to get a little weird. And I thought, well, what if I take these angels who, Gabriel means the strength of God. Raphael means the healer of God. Michael means who is like God. So like, what if I just make the name? Like, because again, a Hebrew saying Gabriel, they're saying strength of God. So the strength, the healer, the incomparable. And then Satan became the accuser, right? Because that's what Ha-Satan means.
I loved it. Yeah.
And so that let me kind of play with the format and play with that. And then, I just, with all of these characters, I had to start with, let's assume they thought that they were the hero of their own story. So how could the accuser decide he wanted to go to war with the creator of all things and think that was good?
Yeah.
Not even that he had a chance of winning. Like, what if he didn't think he was going to win? But what if he just thought this was a stand he had to make it? And so, trying to find that story.
Well, I mean, to be able to pull that off as a tragedy is really powerful.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad it worked.
Yeah. Well, and I personally think I will start referring to myself as the incomparable. So, like,
yes, perfect. Yeah.
FYI.
I know. It's kind of like that character came out real good. I was like, man, I was kind of like scared of that character a little bit, and I was like, okay, I kind of think that's maybe how he would have come across. So Satan was the other one that I wrote a lot more material for, because I just wanted to spend more time with that character. And so they weren't exactly deleted scenes, but I called them deleted scenes because I didn't want to call them 5 different things. But I actually wrote the temptation sequence between him and Jesus in the wilderness.
Oh, wow.
That was one of the deleted scenes I published on my blog. And so, again, trying to write that in such a way that I felt like Jesus would actually be tempted by it, which means writing in a way that I felt like I would be tempted by it, right? Like, because again, throw yourself off the top of the temple. I'd just be like, nah, thanks.
Right.
And then again, I started having so much fun with like, what does it mean that Satan showed Jesus all of the kingdoms of the world? I was like, well, gosh, like, what was going on in China in 30 AD? Like, what was going on on the American continents? Like, these would have been the places that Satan would have showed to Christ. And then I tried to imagine, because I'm one of those people, so my theological conviction is that Jesus was not omniscient while he was incarnate. Like, I think that's one of the divine privileges he set aside. And I cite things like when the disciples ask him before the resurrection when the return is, and he's like, I don't know. And then after the resurrection, they ask him, and he's like, none of your business. Right? So, like, there's like a clear distinction. And so the scene that I wrote in that temptation sequence is he sees a bunch of different stuff, but the one where they really spend some time is in a Mayan, or I think it was an Aztec ritual, and they're seeing these people being paraded for a human sacrifice, and they're doing these chants to their gods, and Satan is observing. You don't know the names of these gods. You don't know who they're praying to. You can't even speak these languages. You have no idea how to communicate with these people. Let alone, I can tell you like every hidden sin. I can tell you like every secret flaw. Like, I can tell you every dark dream. Like, I can give you the keys to this kingdom. Like, I can expose every weak point that you can exploit, and I can teach you how to rule this.
Wow.
Right? All you have to do is, like, agree to follow my lead. And as Jesus is watching this parade, he's like, I don't know exactly what's going on here, but I recognize the same imperial impulse that I see in the Romans. Right? Like, he kind of recognizes humanity as humanity, and following this way that Satan is tempting him with will not win him anything. It'll just make him another Caesar.
Wow.
Right? And so it's like, I don't know. It ended up being one of my favorite things I've ever written, because it was just it was so challenging. And that's not even in the book. That was just like some bonus content I wrote, like, that's over on my blog. So
your blog, norvalrogers.com, by the way.
that's right. Shaggy from Scooby-Doo's real name.
right.
If you can't remember how to spell it, just Google that.
That's right.
That's hilarious.
Man, this is so great. I wish we had 3 more hours. But yeah, I'll actually pivot the floor to you for the final button. If you have any questions for us, and if you don't, that's fine. But if you
so I'm curious, where, as you were reading through, were there any characters that anything that particularly surprised you, or any like nuggets that you just really particularly enjoyed? Particularly since both of you have a history with Scripture, and probably like me, were not unfamiliar with most of these characters.
Right. I'll go first, if that's okay. One of the ones that stands out to me, that is the very first thing that came to my mind when you asked this question, was your treatment of, and now her name's escaping me, is it Herodias, the one who...
Yes.
Okay, so your treatment of Herodias, who asks Salome to ask for the head of John the Baptist. But that whole interaction, the whole interplay, I did love. Well, first of all, it's a substantial amount of it's a substantial piece of imaginative fiction to see how she got into her place. Like, she's always treated as this just vicious, nasty, almost has vampire fangs in my head of the way she's so frequently treated. But the way you propped up this almost as if she was looking for several ways to avoid the ultimate decision that she got to, and then finally saying, like, there's no other way. He's got to die, because this is not going to stop. I'm not going to bring him around. This is never going to end. So I just have to end it. And that just as an imaginative way of looking at that story really stood out to me. I thought it was a fantastic piece of imagination and very, very well executed.
Yeah, I mean, in broad strokes, I've referenced what would be my answer. I mean, I think purely from a empathy standpoint, since we're talking about Judas, was very resonant, because we are so dismissive of him, just culturally and historically, and so to see a story fleshed out that makes him sort of a victim of his own machinations and those who would use him was really powerful. But honestly, like, I think what so surprised me just about the text in general would be put in a more direct fashion than I think I've probably done earlier, is just one, to be a judgmental jerk about what might be coming, and then just to be really surprised by the flavor, and not just the flavor, but the degree to which my own spirit resonates with the posture of the text. I wrote down, I think it is in the epilogue, like the sentence, "There's no such thing as monsters," and I'm like, I mean, that is how I try to operate in the world. That's how my wife and I try to talk to our children. And this, I understand it's a balancing act, and some people would maybe challenge this, but it's like, there aren't bad people. People become victims of certain systems, and there are wrong choices, and there are harmful choices, but to presume an inherent wickedness in a person simply because of fill in the blank is to not carry the heart of Jesus and the Spirit and the Comforter who wants their redemption and restoration. You subvert that work when you when you ignore that, what I would call reality. And so I just really loved that that's the general through line of the text, and there's no such thing as monsters. Anyway, so
it pained me as a horror fan to write that sentence.
I know, right?
Well,
But that's what we have to acknowledge, right? Yeah, I mean, monsters are fun in stories, but that's where they belong.
Well, but
It's true.
but, yeah, I mean, I think we host a horror themed podcast, but I don't think either Reed or I would largely say that the bulk of what we cover is because there are ignoring the conversation about sort of spiritual what have yous, but or heinousness in culture and in the real world, but I think what I'm trying to say is be encouraged that you like horror and monsters, because usually those are meant as examinations of what we fear and what, sort of can exist in the world and what we do with those things when we encounter them. So, don't beat yourself up too much, JR. Let me help you out here a little bit.
Thank you.
This has been substantial for us, JR. I hope you've enjoyed being on here. I feel really edified and enriched by this conversation. I'm gonna sleep well tonight. But if you could please just tell, we've already mentioned your blog, norvalrogers.com. You've talked about a few of your podcasts. Let our listeners know how they can get in touch with you. Obviously, where they can find the book besides Amazon.com if there's another option. But let us know how we can get in touch with you and everything.
Yeah, so the book's available from InterVarsity Press. That's the publisher, and they were my favorite house before they decided to publish me. So I mean, I just cannot recommend their books highly enough.
Yeah,
they have so. I honestly feel like when they said they wanted to publish my book, I was like, are you sure? Like with all of these, okay. So yeah, I mean, if you're a reader of books and you're a believer, particularly, let me say this: you don't have to take my word for it. I've been doing a lot of radio for Empathy for the Devil, and 2 different national radio hosts have told me that they get tons of books from all these different publishers, and the books that they most look forward to reading are the InterVarsity Press books.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's from people that get a lot of free books and don't have time to read them all. They say they pick the IVP books first.
Wow.
So, if that tells you anything. The title, IVP Greenlit, my agent actually had me shop the book under a different title because he said it was too hot for Christian publishing. The cover was 100. That was the first cover option they sent me.
Wow.
From their in-house designer. Yeah. I mean, I'm telling you, they're an A+ first class house. So if you're a reader and you like books, check out their stuff, and you can get empathy from them. A lot of good stuff there. Everything else, if I have a weekly newsletter I do every Friday called Stuff You'll Probably Like, where I do some pop culture recommendations. I might do something I found interesting during the week, like an article or two, and then I always do a scripture reflection where I do kind of like a miniature devotional. It's usually between 500 and 700 words, and then I do have writing updates too. I put when this episode airs, that'll go in my Friday newsletter. It's
gotcha.
Hey, I got to be on this podcast. Whatever Storyman and All Things Charity Don't Split Up came out that week, I put on there. I just put a piece up at Think Christian this week on, because they just killed Thor in the comics.
Oh yeah,
again.
I read it. Yeah.
Hey,
so that's,
come on, man! I'm reading Marvel Unlimited. I'm 6 months behind. Come on.
The storyline is called The Death of the Mighty Thor.
Well, I know
I
that.
mean, I feel like they spoiled it.
I love Jane Thor.
Don't beat up our guests, Nathan. We want them back.
R.I.P. Jane. But so again, they killed her right before Good Friday, right?
Sure.
So I was well, we better write about the death of God and Good Friday and Thor.
Right.
So that, a link to that'll be in there because that's not on my normal blog. So I kind of collect all of the things I do on the internet and put them into that one handy little resource. So cool. If you go to stuffyou'llprobablylike.com, you can sign up for that. It's free. Comes out every Friday morning. So nice. This next issue is my 53rd issue. So I've been doing it just over a year now, and I haven't missed a week.
That's
which
cool.
is a little
Congrats.
Insane because it's a lot of content, but
that's cool, man. Well,
and then I'm on Facebook, Twitter, all the Instagram,
all the good stuff. Yeah.
All the regular places.
What is your Twitter handle?
It's always at JR Forasteros.
Gotcha.
So good luck trying to spell my last name. That's what it is.
Cannot thank you enough. This episode went a little longer than we expected to, but I am so happy to have had you. We want you back. We might have you back just to talk
anytime you want
about a movie. Because this has been great. So
both versions of The Descent. So be ready.
We'll do the Descent Redux where we're actually prepared this time, and we'll bring you in to give some new thoughts. But no, sincerely, JR, thank you so much for your book. Thank you for all that you do, and thank you very, very much for spending this time with us. As we say on every episode, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but it's not the end of the conversation. And can continue this conversation with either me or Nathan or JR. We'll have our social media cues in the end credits of the show. So yeah, thank you so much again for being with us, and guys, we'll catch you next week.
JR.
Thanks, guys. It's been an honor.
Thank you. Bye. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but not the end of the conversation. To continue this conversation, you can follow us on Twitter at The Fear of God. You can visit us on Facebook to comment on one of our posts or post there yourself. You can follow Reed on Twitter at Reed Lackey. You can follow Nathan on Twitter at The Nathan Rouse. Visit morethanonelesson.com to leave a comment on this post or any of the other official episode posts. Email us, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com, all one word, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. And last but not least, if you listen to us through iTunes, we would greatly appreciate a rating or review. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.